Hello. Uh, Hello, my name is Leslie Miller. I'm the California Policy Manager here at Google, and I am pleased to introduce Eric and our current Insurance Commissioner and Republican candidate for governor, Steve Poizner. First, I'd like to just say a few remarks about Mr. Poizner before they get started, and then Eric is going to do some Q&A with them and open it up to Googlers. Steve has had some great success here in Silicon Valley. He founded two companies. Both of them were acquired, the latter being acquired by Qualcomm for a sizable amount of money. It's up to him if he wants to discuss that. But after he sold his last company, he took a detour and has been committed to public service since then. He was a White House fellow. He taught at a local high school around here for a year, and he's been our insurance commissioner for the last few years. And for those of you who don't know what an insurance commissioner is or the importance of that, it is when you imagine insurance companies increasing their rates or going after you for more money than what you think is fair as a consumer. It's his responsibility to run the agency that has consumer protection. So it's an important job, and I'm pleased to introduce our insurance commissioner, Steve Poizner, and Eric.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, Eric.
Thank you very much for coming here to Google as part of our series on our upcoming gubernatorial race. I have a very simple question. It seems to me, if I look at California, you've got so far $41 billion budget deficit. You have a situation in the legislature where it requires a 2/3 majority to essentially enact anything that involves spending. Redistricting and politics make it almost impossible to build a consensus, according to everyone who's part of it. 1 million people, a budget that never gets signed, huge frustration with the local government. Why are you running for this job?
Well, Eric, I came here for a pep talk. Actually, it's a great question. I get this question all the time on the campaign trail, like, why on earth would you want to be governor in the midst of this meltdown? I mean, this is the worst economic crisis in the state's 160-year history. You know, we have 3,000 people a week that pick up and leave the state of California. The schools are deteriorating. You talked about the budget deficit. We're out of cash, basically bankrupt as a state, worst credit rating in the country. Honestly, this is the best time to be running for governor. It's the best time to be governor. Sometimes it takes a huge meltdown, a huge crisis, in order to galvanize a new working coalition of people. Now, over the course of our chat here, we'll talk about some of my positions on policy, but honestly, I'm not here as a partisan warrior. I'm here to gather together a group of Californians, Republicans, Democrats, and independents alike, to put together a new working coalition of folks to get our state back. I think California's headed in completely the wrong direction, totally. I want to take California in a completely different direction. Sometimes a real meltdown, a real crisis is exactly what it takes in order to get at some of the structural problems that face our state. And if I can mention one other thing, I came here 30 years ago from Texas. Maybe my Texas accent will come out here. I love California. California's worth fighting for. This is just a beautiful state, great people, great natural resources. State's in deep trouble, and I just can't sit on the sidelines.
So it's interesting that you're here at Google. You went to Stanford Business School. You have a double E degree. Always good to see engineers in politics.
Is there any engineers here?
That's right.
Yes, okay, good. Finally, because in Sacramento it can be pretty lonely for us engineers there.
Well, we're sending our best and brightest somewhere else. It's in Sacramento.
Yes.
And it's interesting that your first company was a mapping company of some kind, and your second company was a GPS company. So when you come to Google, do you see the technology that you worked on? What is the connection between what you did as a young entrepreneur? Because you're in what I read about you, you're basically an entrepreneur. You've started companies, is what you think. Does it show up here?
And thank you for calling me an entrepreneur. I really do think that is the one word, if someone asked me just one word, what are you? I'm an entrepreneur, and not only in the private sector, but I've been an entrepreneur in public education reform with the charter school movement at the Department of Insurance. I got to say, I'm thrilled to see some of the things that I worked on in my first two companies. You all have taken full advantage of these technologies, and it really blossomed. I mean, my first company, Strategic Mapping, 1982, could have been the first digital mapping technology for PCs and Macintoshes back then. We developed a geographic information systems technology that before was like SAS graph on a mainframe. We moved all that down to a PC with a nice user interface. And we sold tens of thousands of copies to people who wanted to analyze data that had some geographic component to it and then display it in map form on a PC or Macintosh. Then my second company came out of my first company. People started to use our mapping software with GPS systems to map out the locations of things on a map. And so my second company came out of that idea. I was watching a TV show one day where someone was being reported upon who had major handicaps, was in a wheelchair in the back of a van. The van comes to a grinding halt on railroad tracks. Person whips out the cell phone after the driver has a heart attack, passes out. The person who's handicapped talks to the 911 operator, help me, my van is on a railroad track, the driver is passed out, and then the 911 operator never could locate the person in time, and that person got hit by a train and killed him. And I said, I'm going to start a company to solve that problem. And so my second company, SnapTrack, we figured out a way to put a GPS receiver into a cell phone. Now, maybe there's some electrical engineers in the audience. In Sacramento, I never get to talk about this, so let me just say that it is hard to put a GPS receiver into a cell phone and make it work. GPS receivers were designed to be used in airplanes and ships where you have a clear view of the sky. We figured it out. 700 million cell phones have this SnapTrack location feature, sold it to Qualcomm, and of course, you all take full advantage of the fact that cell phones are now location aware, and it's fantastic to see it.
Well, my guess is people here are young enough that they assume it's always been true that cell phones had GPS in it, and now we know where it came from. So after you did these successful businesses, you ended up in education, basically as a teacher. Why the shift, and what sort of, you obviously as governor are going to have to deal with education, which is roughly half, or on the order of half of the state's budget. What did you learn there?
Well, after running companies in Silicon Valley here for 20 years, I did decide a few years ago I just can't sit on the political sidelines, and I have to take steps to start getting California back on track. I mean, it's clear even a few years ago that California's heading off a cliff, and the people that run our state from both parties pretty much oblivious to the fact that we're now in this new global economy where competition's intense. Now, our public schools are just deteriorating. It's just a fact. If we don't get our public schools back on track, we'll never fix our great state. How many of you went to California public schools? Just curious. Well, maybe most of you here. That's the irony, I think. When many of you went to public schools, best in the country. California had the best public education system in the country, bar none, and we've gone from first to worst in a very short period of time. So I decided, the engineer that I am, decided to plunge in, get into the trenches in order to understand the issues firsthand. So I decided to volunteer as a teacher. Well, easier said than done. They didn't exactly embrace me, the public school system. I don't have a teaching credential. In fact, Eric, do you have a teaching credential? Do you know that you could walk into a high school district right now and they wouldn't let you teach? I mean, they would, of course, be honored to have you as a guest teacher. But what happened with me, I'm sure would happen to you or anybody at this point. It's really hard to get into the public school system. That's a problem that needs to be changed. I remember walking into the East Side Union High School District, which is on Story and White, East San Jose, about 45 minutes from my home, walked in there and said, I want to volunteer and teach. I'm not looking for compensation. I just want to help as much as I can and learn as much as I can. And the head of personnel comes out. It was during lunch. She had this scowl on her face, a little mustard in her lip, and she asked me, well, what can I do for you? Why are you here? I said, I'm looking to volunteer and teach. She says, what qualifies you to be in the classroom? I said, well, let me think about it. And I said, okay, I have an electrical engineering degree from the University of Texas at Austin, graduated #1 in my class, then came to Stanford Business School, got an MBA with honors from Stanford. Then I spent 20 years starting and running high-tech companies in Silicon Valley, pretty successfully. And then last year I was in the White House, where I worked in the National Security Council and their counterterrorism group. I got there 1 week before the 9/11 crisis, helped build a new Homeland Security plan for the whole country without missing a beat. Eric, she points at me and she says, nothing you've said qualifies you to be in the classroom. Now, hey, I don't have a big ego or anything, but my ego shrank in size that day as she sent me packing. But I didn't give up, so I finally got into the classroom by getting guest teacher status.
So why don't you just create a charter school in that situation? You're an entrepreneur.
Well, funny you should say something about charter schools. So I learned everything I needed to know about the public schools the first day I was teaching. I taught 12th grade American government after getting guest teacher status at Mount Pleasant High School in East San Jose. I learned everything I needed to know the first day. It rained the first day, and it leaked in my classroom, and I had to position the trash can in the right spot to collect the rainwater. Now, really, public high school, wealthy Silicon Valley, leaky roof. Just shameful. Who runs the school? How come they can't fix the roof at Mount Pleasant High School? Well, when you all went to the public schools, the teachers and the principals and the educators controlled the schools and the budgets. Not anymore. The legislature has taken over the running of the public schools through the state education code. Now, the state education code are these mandates that they apply uniformly to all public schools at the same time. There's 10,000 public schools. That's just crazy. So one reason why I'm running for governor, I'm going to rip control of the public schools out of the hands of Sacramento politicians. I'm going to move it down to the local level where it belongs and where it used to be. And I became so convinced that local control is a key part of the answer here. I then went off to help pioneer the growth of the charter school movement. I am the founder of the California Charter Schools Association. I've worked closely with Reed Hastings and others to build a bunch of charter schools in East Palo Alto and Oakland. I believe charter schools is a key part of the answer. See, charter schools are public schools, but they're granted waivers from the education code. The education code in the 1960s was this size. Now the education code is this size, 2,400 pages and growing rapidly. I want to give all public schools the same type of freedom and flexibility that charter schools have. There's over 800 charter schools right now in California, the most important education reform activity going on right now, in my opinion.
So after the charter school movement, you ended up as our insurance commissioner. And now you actually work, live, and breathe in Sacramento, correct?
Well, actually, I have over 1,000 employees and 16 offices, and so I do lots of traveling around. I do have maybe 20–30% of my time ends up in Sacramento. My largest office is in Los Angeles, so lots of moving around.
So from the perspective of a Silicon Valley entrepreneur who has gone voluntarily, apparently, to Sacramento to serve us, what's it actually like? What is the correct criticism for the culture, the decision-making? If you're governor, they're all going to work for you. And you can't fire them.
Right. So I have a... You can't fire these people either. They're pretty good, too. I have an 18-year-old daughter, and she just loves to tease me that, Dad, you have the most boring job in the state of California, insurance commissioner. That's probably what some of you might be thinking right now. Insurance commissioner turns out to be a fantastic job, though. It's only one of 8 positions elected statewide. I do have this massive oversight of everything insurance in California, and that turns out to be a big number, about $160 billion industry, about 10% of the economy. I love my job because when I make a decision, it impacts everybody, every business, every consumer, every family. So when I get there, first it's 3 years ago, culture shock, right? So I'm used to Silicon Valley companies. I get there, over 1,000 employees. All of my employees practically are lifetime civil servants. And what that means is that you're part of the civil service system. You really cannot be fired. It's almost impossible. So in addition to their civil service protection, they also belong to public employee unions. And so there's collective bargaining agreements that sit on top of the civil service protection. So it took me maybe, 5 minutes to realize this is not like running a company in Silicon Valley. But Eric, your point's exactly right. Do I want to get anything done or not? This is my team. And I had bold, aggressive agenda and goals and objectives. So I had to change, and so I had to evolve. So the first thing I did was to go meet them all. It took me a few months, met all 1,000 of my employees, and together we built a strategic plan for the Department of Insurance. We did so by doing a top-down review of every dollar spent, every program. I asked lots of questions. Why are we doing this program here? And all too often the answer was, well, we've been doing it this way for 50 years. Well, does it help anybody? Well, not that we can tell. Then stop it. We got rid of dozens of programs that really didn't make much difference. Other programs we ramped up. That's the good thing about a strategic plan, right? You're reallocating resources to optimize. Take my fraud unit. I have a couple hundred police officers that work for me in my insurance fraud unit, going after insurance fraud in the middle of a deep recession. Now that's a high priority because insurance fraud drives up insurance rates. We've arrested over 2,000 people for insurance fraud in the last couple of years. That's more people to be arrested for insurance fraud than any other 2-year period ever. But the overall impact on my budget, because we're in the middle of a financial meltdown, my operating expenses are now lower permanently by 15%. I've generated this big surplus at the Department of Insurance. I've passed this surplus back into the marketplace with tax cuts on insurance agents and companies that fund my department. Now, the last time the Department of Insurance did a strategic plan in its 130-year history was, well, never. And it can be done. And so one thing I'm going to do as governor is I'm going to do the same thing across the other 399 different state departments and state agencies. These are good people who work for the state of California. The system has got lots of constraints, but people who work, public employees, will respond to great leadership, just like people here respond to great leadership.
So did you find a view, did you develop a view about the union structure and culture of Sacramento? In particular, it's widely reported that the teachers union and the prisons union and so forth have a great deal of power. Has that been your experience?
Yes, no question. And so all my employees are public employee union members. I have fantastic employees at the Department of Insurance, honestly. But the public employee union leadership is a problem. And we Californians are going to have to address it. Public employee unions are a very small percentage of the total population. They have the lion's share of the political power. And they use their political power in a very sophisticated way. And they have pretty much access to unlimited political resources by tapping in to the paychecks of public employee union members, do automatic payroll deductions, and they create these massive political action committee war chests. And they have used this political power to negotiate unsustainable compensation structures and pension programs, to block reform. So we're going to have to take this power back. I do support a constitutional amendment that would curb the power of the public employee unions by forcing the public employee unions to get permission from the employees first before they yank money out of their paychecks for political purposes. And so if public employees want to contribute to political causes, that's their right, but they should have to do so with their permission in advance. That would be an important step to curb that power right now that pretty much blocks any kind of reform in Sacramento.
So let's talk about this in the context of how the governor actually works. There's the theoretical model where the governor goes out and gives speeches, provides great leadership to the state, and then there's the reality, which even the Terminator could not overcome, which is the gridlock that exists among the political parties. As I understand it, there's a majority of Democratic support. The Republicans are relatively different in view on both social and financial issues. The horse trading is severe. We went through in the last couple of years, you were there, so you were right in the middle of it, 2 essentially failed budget processes, which ultimately have resulted in an unsolvable budget situation. So what do you, as governor, how will you horse trade better than the previous governor?
Yeah, if Schwarzenegger couldn't do it, how can you do it? I get that question a lot. No one's ever confused me with Arnold, that's for sure. I do have a black belt. I think I could take him if I had to, but...
Thank goodness that's not how our politics works. Only in Korea does that work.
That could be a step in the right direction, you never know. Look, we're in a very serious crisis right now, and it really is a meltdown. Complete functional dysfunction, really, in the legislature and in Sacramento. There's no easy answers. And I enter this race with the full appreciation of how hard it's going to be. But just like any crisis, there's some steps you can go through to make progress. The first step is you got to identify what the problem is and then just be honest with people about it. Second step is to come up with a plan of action. How are you going to fix it? And then the third step is to have great leaders, rise up and rally the troops and to get a new working coalition. So the way I'm running for governor is vastly different than my opponent. My opponent, Meg Whitman, in the Republican primary, she won't even come here. Take your questions. She doesn't do debates. I mean, it's just a different strategy. You all can figure out, what strategy is the best for California. My strategy is to be very open about my positions. And I'm going to take some positions today that I know you're going to disagree with, and that's okay. You're not going to agree with me on everything. The question really is, do I have the leadership skills and the vision to get California back on track in the middle of this deep crisis? So I'm going to be very specific here today with you, as well as through the rest of the campaign. And then when I'm elected, it will be with a mandate. Okay, we knew exactly where he stood. Didn't agree with him on everything, but he had pretty much the right idea to get this broken state fixed. We're going to send Poizner to Sacramento with marching orders, go get it done. And that extra political capital that I'm going to have once I have this mandate in place is going to be very essential to making progress in Sacramento. Second part of my strategy is to use the powers of the governor's office like you've never seen before. The governor on paper, very powerful here in California. The line item veto power, the statute veto power, the appointments power, huge. And I'm going to focus this authority, this power on a reform agenda that's focused on bringing jobs back to California and fixing the public schools. And that'll give us a chance in the middle of this crisis, you know, with voter mandates to actually make progress. I mean, the alternative is California falls off a cliff. You know, that's unthinkable. If enough people rise up and say, no, we want a different direction, then we can make progress.
Let's talk about the actual race. You must have a plan to win. You've got 2 months till the Republican primary. Can you describe what it's going to take? As I understand it, again, your competitor, Meg Whitman, has greater name recognition. She's spent more money than you, and so forth. Can you describe in what ways you're different from her? And and I believe this is a Republican primary, and I believe it's mostly Republicans who vote in the Republican primary.
Yep.
How will you get them to vote for you instead of the other significant opponent, Meg?
By the way, if you're a declined to state voter, you can also vote in the Republican primary or the Democratic primary.
So let's be clear what the actual rules are. A registered Republican can vote for or against you, and a declined to state can vote for you or against you, and a registered Democrat should not vote. That would be illegal.
That's it. You got it. That's exactly right.
We like precise instructions around here.
Okay. And June 8th is the primary.
And June 8th is the primary.
Right. Well, Google, you all were founded in 1998, yeah? I do feel a lot like Google back when you were starting your company, because how many search engines were on the market when you all came around? A lot. And not many people gave Google much of a chance back then, because there were a lot of search engines on the market and big, huge players, and so how can Google survive? Well, it turns out you all had the best search engine, best product, and people figured it out. I feel the same way about this Republican primary. I'm up against the establishment. I'm up against someone who's spent $59 million so far. Well, actually, she's put $59 million of her own money into the campaign. She's spent about $50 million so far and growing.
And your number is?
I've put $20 million in my campaign. I thought that was a lot of money. And
so and you spent?
We've spent maybe 5 or 6 or 7 million so far. So we've saved our money here to the end. Now, you got to note that the most money that's ever been spent in a Republican primary for governor in the history of the country was about $20 million. So Meg Whitman is now, she's going to blow that out by a factor of 4x. And you got to, people are going to start asking, why are you spending so much money? What are you trying to compensate for? Why does it take so much money in the middle of this deep recession? What's the purpose of the saturation advertising? So in my case, I got to get the word out though. So if I was here today talking to you and I didn't have any money, no matter how strong of a candidate, it's this kind of moot point. But I do have plenty of money. Won't get anywhere close to Meg Whitman's money. Doesn't have to be that way. So just like back then when consumers started to compare search engines, people here in the Republican primary, they know that the state's broken. They know that the Republican Party needs to be revitalized. They're going to do their comparing and their contrasting. And I can promise you all this, everyone who's eligible to vote in the Republican primary will know all about me by Election Day. And we're going to have the money on TV and radio and the web to get the word out.
And how will they see you, in your view, as different from your other competitor?
So part of my challenge is to get people to understand that Meg Whitman and I couldn't be any different. Just because we're from the same area here, a lot of people put us both in the same bucket.
Well, in fact, all three leading candidates are from the Bay Area.
And that drives people in Southern California nuts, by the way. Only one of us running in the Republican primary has actually started companies from scratch. Now, Eric, there's nothing wrong with being a large company, Fortune 500 CEO type. Nothing wrong with that at all. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But that's not me. I'm an engineer. I'm an entrepreneur. I build things. I fix things. Meg Whitman is a marketing, branding expert, and it's just different, her strengths and her background. Honestly, I think as people compare and contrast, if they're looking to rebrand the state, they're going to vote for her. If they want the state to be rebuilt, they're going to look to someone with my type of skill set. Between the two of us, only one of us has actually run for office before, and won in my case. Only one of us has taken a large state agency and shrunk it, made it more efficient, less money being spent, more productivity being had. Only one of us has been in a classroom for an extended period of time. Only one of us has actually voted most of our lives, and that's a big issue. And so Meg's going to have to explain, how do you go from not being a Republican, not voting, have no connection to public service at all, and now she wants to be governor. And so people are going to start digging into why all is this money being spent, what's her background, what's my background. I'm just going to focus on my unique experience of 20 years of starting and running companies from scratch here in Silicon Valley. I know how to bring jobs back to California, which is essential. But at the same time now, I have 8 years of success in politics and public sector service. It's not like running a business in Sacramento, as you've already noted, Eric. It's about having the leadership skills to put coalitions of people together. I've proven I can get that done as an entrepreneur in both the private sector and in the public sector.
So you've taken what are considered to be, the Republican primary has ended up being focused on a lot of social issues, as best I can tell, as opposed to some of the other themes, maybe because people aren't really focused on the general election until the fall. And of course, you have 2 elections. You have the Republican primary, which you need to win, and then of course you have the general election, should you win that. On the social side of the Republican primary, there's been a lot of discussion about your positions on, let's just go through the list,
Yep.
Immigration, Prop 8, AB 32, a couple of others. You want to sort of give us your political and policy views on that so we can get that out here with this audience? I'm sure people will have questions about that. And you've also been criticized by your opponent for having changed your mind. So here's a good opportunity to say, what do you really think?
Right. Well, I am a pretty conservative person in terms of my passion for small government, low taxes. I want to create an environment for lots of innovation. I'm a big believer that our government spending has gotten completely out of control. I do think California has become the most liberal state in the country. And I don't say that really as a criticism of liberalism per se. It's just a fact that if you look at the number of government programs that have been started to solve problems for people, California has led the way in terms of putting one program in after another. And most of these programs are very ineffective. And now the jury's in. The state is bankrupt. We now have, at least the current short-term budget deficit is $20 billion. You know, we're firing teachers. I mean, this is a mess. So 8 years from now, maybe a more liberal agenda might appeal to people. Not right now, though. I think Republicans, Democrats, and independents alike are coming to the conclusion that we need to get back to some basic principles. We've got to balance the budget. We have to properly fund high-priority programs like public education and higher education. We have to scale back this mentality of people tapping into government benefits as a way of life. And so I'm running on a pretty conservative platform. Some people point out, well, you know, you seem more conservative than you used to be. Well, I've always been pretty conservative. In fact, I know some of you are too young for this maybe, but Family Ties, the TV show, I was the Alex P. Keaton of my household, for sure. I've been a Republican for a long time. I know I'm in a, there's not, I don't know how many Republicans are here, but I suspect not as many as I hope there would be here in Silicon Valley. But I'll say this, after the last few years of being in Sacramento, Eric, I now have even more insights into the dysfunction in Sacramento and all the wasteful spending and all the tax rates that are driving people out of the state. My conservative principles have crystallized in my mind. And since I started getting involved in politics, for the last 4 or 5 years, the state's unemployment rates doubled, our budget deficits ballooned, our tax rates have gone way up. And so part of my platform that I am pitching on the campaign trail is based on the current situation we find ourselves in. And so what I'm proposing is what it's going to take, to get California back on track. Okay, so some specifics. On some social issues, of course, people want to know where you stand on social issues. I believe social issues are important. Some of my positions on social issues are likely going to differ from some people here. That's fine. We can disagree on those. But what I really do think the most important thing of all, though, is we've got to fix the public schools and we've got to bring jobs back. And on a lot of these issues, I think we can probably agree. On the controversial issues, let's just get them out here. On Proposition 8, I've supported Proposition 8. I do believe in traditional marriage. I believe in marriage should be between a man and a woman. It's not the engineer in me that feels that way. It's more of on issues like that, it's more of a gut of what you think is the right way to do it. That's my view. It's always been my view there. On abortion, I am pro-choice, but I do believe that we should drive the number of abortions down to 0 as best we can. That's why I do want to take steps to reduce the number of abortions. I don't think abortion should be just another medical procedure. That's why I support parental notification. I also want to end taxpayer-funded benefits for abortions. Well, those are those controversial social issues. Let's go to something less controversial: illegal immigration. Just kidding. That's controversial too. One of the key cornerstones to my campaign is my focus on trying to address the problems of illegal immigration. I mean, honestly, there hasn't been a politician in 20 years that's even mentioned the words, because most of them don't have the guts. It's one of those issues where you can't even have a conversation without people starting to criticize you. The fact is, legal immigration has been a fantastic thing for California. I mean, fantastic. Legal immigration is part of the backbone of this great economy. I want to make the legal immigration pipeline as big as possible. Eric and I were talking before we started here about my support for expanding the H-1B visa program substantially, my belief that we should be stapling green cards to diplomas of people who come here to our colleges and universities. We don't want great people to come here to UC Berkeley or to Stanford or anywhere and then be forced out because they can't get a visa. That's crazy. So let's make the legal immigration pipe as big as we can. But illegal immigration is a different story. And again, I want to be a truth teller in this campaign. We can't afford it any longer. We spend billions and billions of dollars in taxpayer-funded benefits for people who come here illegally. And it's something that's causing us a very difficult time in terms of balancing the budget. Now, in the public schools, I saw it firsthand. It overwhelms the public schools. It overwhelms the emergency rooms and the healthcare system. We have to take steps, in my opinion, to turn the magnets off. Now, I did work in the White House. I was in the National Security Council. I am very concerned about border security, but I'm pretty convinced, even though we need better border security, I'm pretty convinced you can't build a wall long enough or a fence high enough. This is about incentives. People come here to tap into to jobs and to taxpayer-funded benefits. And as governor, I will take steps, to turn off those magnets. We should stop taxpayer-funded benefits for people that are here illegally, and we should make sure that if you're an employer and you hire someone, you better hire someone that's here legally. As governor, if a company hires people illegally, I will revoke their business license. And if you turn off those magnets, what's going to happen is that people will change their behavior. Hopefully people won't come here in the first place illegally if we turn these magnets off.
So why don't we get some questions from the audience? Let me ask sort of my last formal question, which is, in terms of the politics here, the state has large, relatively liberal city centers, LA and San Francisco and so forth, and then a reasonably mixed suburban area, and then lots and lots of conservative rural areas. So is it fair to say that your challenge, you'll get the rural areas because of the Republican history there and your positions and so forth, is the challenge to speak to the urban dweller? Is that the way to say the problem before you?
Now, if I was running for the U.S. Senate or State Assembly, it'd be a different campaign completely, and I might not be, the right fit for that kind of campaign. I wouldn't be interested in that kind of campaign. I'm running for governor for all the people, both Republicans, Democrats, Independents alike. The issues that I'm talking about are just affect all Californians. If you look at all the people who've ever been elected governor in California over the last 100 years, there's only been a handful of elected Democratic governors, even though the legislature is dominated by Democrats. People understand that the governor is not a partisan warrior, but the leader of the entire state, and that we need checks and balances. So it's a remarkable thing how many people vote for a Republican governor, because honestly, to turn this state over to just one party in Sacramento would be a disaster, complete disaster. I have an excellent chance of being your next governor because the state's in the middle of this massive meltdown. People are going to be looking for problem solvers with a track record, no matter which party they come from.
Yes, sir.
So I understand that you have...
Let me just remind everybody that you are on the record.
Gotcha.
Trust me.
I understand that you have proposed and still plan to force insurance companies to divest from Iran, which I support, and I commend you for standing behind that, since the insurance industry has been coming after you for it. And I know that they are, they hired the campaign team that did Prop 8 to, plant news articles and op-eds against you. And I'm just wondering, like, what what your view is of how we need to reform the influence of business on the political process. You talked about public employee unions, but in my view, the runaway power is independent expenditures from corporations in California and these other kinds of tax like the ones against you that aren't even disclosed.
Well, thank you for asking an insurance question. As insurance commissioner, one of my most important duties is to make sure that insurance companies stay financially sound. And I mentioned my over 1,000 employees. I have a big chunk of them are in financial surveillance, where we monitor the 1,300 insurance companies that do business in California very closely. In the middle of the financial meltdown, we were making sure that they stayed financially strong. I'm pleased to report we've been able to keep most insurance companies safe and secure. And so when you turn in a legitimate claim, after you pay, you pay for your auto insurance and your health insurance and your earthquake insurance year after year after year. If you have a legitimate claim, there better be money there to pay off legitimate claims. That's why my financial surveillance duties are important. When I was looking at the financial health of insurance companies, I found that they have this massive investment portfolio. $4 trillion is the global investment portfolio for insurance companies. They're the largest investor group in the world. At least $6 billion invested in Iran in their military, nuclear, and defense sectors. It's just wrong. And so I'm pushing them as hard as I can with all of my powers and duties and persuasive skills to get them to divest. It's just they can do better than that. They have no business really investing in companies that are propping up the Iranian regime. I think the Iranian regime is just crystal clear. They're a big danger to its own people, to its neighbors, and to our national security. Now, $6 billion turns out to be 2 or 3% of Iran's gross domestic product. It's a very small, tiny percentage of their investment portfolio. They could easily divest here. And so of the 1,300 insurance companies, I've gotten over 750 to agree to not only voluntarily divest, but to not invest in any new investments in Iran in the future. Now, there's a few hundred insurance companies that are fighting back hard. They just want to maximize their returns independent of the impact that they're having on our national security, and I'm going to fight them on it. And the fact that they're pushing back on me so hard should tell you something, that Republican or Democrat, doesn't matter. I will do what it takes to stand up to insurance companies to make sure that they fulfill all their legal obligations to policyholders. When they cancel people's insurance improperly, I'm going to go after them, make sure that they reinstate people's health insurance, even though they canceled it sometimes in the middle of major health procedures. In the case of Iran, I'm going to do what it takes to make sure that they purge their investments. And if I can just say, Google, what you did in China, I'm sure it was a lot of discussion, maybe a big controversy even inside of Google. I don't really know. I only know what I read. But I got to tell you how proud I am to know you all. I think what you did in China was a fantastic thing. There's a big difference between focusing on just the very short term and focusing in on the long term. And I suspect that people who focus on the long term, where censorship is just wrong, investments in Iran are just wrong. Sometimes they're just right and wrong. If you just do the right thing, I'm pretty confident it'll pay off for folks that do that.
Our next question.
Hello. I'd like to ask about Prop 13. As a legal immigrant to the US, I find it really bizarre that I have to pay 10 times as much as my neighbor for essentially the same home. And I don't understand why I need to be punished for coming to work in Silicon Valley.
And this is a question about Prop 13, right? 1978.
Yeah, Prop 13 is very controversial. I support Prop 13, though, for one basic reason. It provides predictability for homeowners. So even though people across the street from each other might be paying different rates, on the other hand, when people get into their homes, they know the situation. When you bought your home, you know what the property tax was going to be, and you know what your mortgage is going to be, and you run the numbers, can you afford it or not? And then Prop 13 starts to benefit you. Once you're a homeowner, then you know what your property taxes are going to be in a very predictable way, for many decades to come, and that will benefit you, longer term. What I like about Prop 13 then is that it doesn't drive people out of their homes. When it passed in 1978, property taxes were being ratcheted up, and some people are on fixed incomes, and so they're having to sell their homes because they didn't have this predictability. So I think having this cap on property taxes is a good thing. The other important part about Prop 13 is that it requires a 2/3 vote to increase taxes in California in most cases. I think that's a good thing too. And I know that's also controversial, but the fact is, even with the 2/3 voting rules, you have to ask yourself, if we made it easier to pass taxes, if we lowered that 2/3 to something less than 2/3, would taxes go up or down? Of course they're going to go up. Now, even though the 2/3 voting rules have been in place now since 1978, do we have low taxes? No. Now, property taxes, even with Prop 13, property taxes are at the national average, median. All of our other taxes are the highest in the country, practically. Highest sales taxes, income taxes, vehicle license fees. We have gas taxes, beer taxes, wine taxes, phone taxes, capital gains taxes. We have 900 different taxes and fees. If you add them all up and divide by the number of people, you get the per capita tax burden 50% higher here in California than nearby western states. I mean, no wonder 3,000 people a week pick up and leave the state of California each and every week because this place is way overtaxed. I would never change those 2/3 voting rules because our taxes will even go up higher. I think taxes have to come down, not up. That's why actually one of the key centerpieces of my campaign is actually to cut taxes. I'm proposing a 10% cut in sales taxes, a 10% cut in corporate taxes, a 10% cut in personal income taxes, every bracket, and a 50% cut in capital gains taxes. Now, people ask me all the time, well, how on earth can we afford a tax cut when we can't even balance the budget as it is? Honestly, the answer is we can't afford not to. We need lower tax rates so we can become competitive again. And then the tax base will increase in size as jobs return to California, and then the tax revenues go up, not down. And just briefly, we did an economic analysis of this. We looked at the other 49 states, and we found a dozen examples of when states actually cut taxes across the board, tax revenues went up, not down, immediately after the tax cut. We need to bring jobs back to California. It's just essential.
Our next question.
Hi, Steve. Thanks for coming today.
Sure.
You mentioned that the expenditure of your department has decreased during your tenure, but what Meg Whitman is saying is that it's increased by like 14%, I believe. What do you say to that?
She's wrong, and she's very misleading. Her negative attacks are ugly, nasty, false. Shame on her. If you see her out there, you tell her. Here's the facts. My operating budget is down by 15% permanently. And you know this is a fact because when I got to the Department of Insurance, I had a budget deficit of about $5 million, structural deficit. Now I have this huge surplus. And I've taken the surplus, and I mentioned tax cuts. I've cut taxes twice on insurance agents and brokers and companies that fund my department to the tunes of millions and millions of dollars. If I hadn't been able to reduce my operating expenses by 15%, I would have never been able to generate the surplus. So this has all been documented, and she's just wrong.
Our next question. Yes,
Which,
sir.
by the way, I must say, you may be looking at the only person in Sacramento history that's ever downsized anything. And right now, and downsizing is not really the perfect word. It's really right-sizing. Now, I know you're in the growth mode, but in Sacramento, they've been in the growth mode for 20 years, unfortunately, and now they need to go into the right-sizing mode. They need to be able to balance. We need to balance the budget with no more taxes, no more gimmicks, no more borrowing. And we can do it, but we're going to have to go through every line of the budget like I have, all 1,200 pages, and we need to overhaul and modernize the entire state of California. It hasn't been done. It can be done. It's essential that we get it done.
Thank you for coming. You mentioned the $20 billion deficit that our state is facing, and you also touched on with the severe gridlock between the legislature and traditionally the governor's mansion, the challenge in cutting costs and programs. So with your tax cuts that you're proposing, can you talk a bit more specifically about how you plan to maybe perhaps bring in more revenue for the state? Are you looking to perhaps stimulate certain sectors of the economy through, for instance, we've had the first-time home buyer credit that's been in effect the last year and a half or so. What specific credits or other policies do you have in mind to perhaps drive up the revenue for the state?
This is a major difference between Meg Whitman and me, by the way. I mean, I mentioned before some of the differences in our background, but we have some major differences on policy. Meg Whitman is definitely a fan of targeted tax cuts, where she wants to stimulate certain sectors. Or I got to tell you, I just completely opposed to that. The idea of empowering a bunch of Sacramento politicians to pick winners and losers, just absolutely wrong, in my opinion. I'm proposing across-the-board tax cuts so that everyone benefits, every consumer, every small business. We want to encourage more people to come here. My last company, SnapTrack, I came here from Texas. I think I've said y'all a couple times. I catch myself, God dang it, I'm giving away where I'm from. I came here from Texas 30 years ago because this was the best place on the planet to start and grow companies. And gosh, it's just, we're just not that way anymore. We've got to get back to that. But I did run some numbers. If I would have started my company back in Texas rather than in California, I had 100 employees when I sold to Qualcomm. And we did sell for $1 billion. It was in the Mercury News. There's no secret. And Qualcomm's a public company, so everyone knows. All my employees were shareholders, and so it was a great thing. But I run some numbers. If I'd have started my company back in Texas rather than in here, state of California would be out $100 million, meaning that my employees paid $100 million in state and local taxes. And so it really makes a difference where companies set up and grow. Eric, we did back of the envelope on Google. Now, it's hard to know for sure, but we ran some numbers. If Google would have started the company in Nevada rather than in California, we estimate at least $10 billion difference. Meaning that if you weren't a California company, California would be $10 billion more in the hole. You all have paid.
In other words, we would have had $10 billion more had we gone to Nevada. Let's get the math right. So when are we moving to Nevada, guys?
No, since 1998, Google, as a company and its employees, have paid $10 billion in state and local taxes. So thank you for being in California. Thank goodness you are here in California. But it all has to do with creating an environment so that the next Google or the next Snaptrack wants to start here. And right now we have an environment with super high taxes, burdensome regulations, and telling you, there's a huge exodus. Cisco, quote, we haven't created a new tech job in California in a decade. Intel standing right next to President Obama, the CEO of Intel, talking about all the expansion of chip manufacturing in this country, none in California. Hewlett-Packard, California is no man's land when it comes to new manufacturing. NUMMI, the last automobile manufacturing plant in California, just closed down last week. 5,000 jobs gone, 25,000 supplier jobs. Why? Taxes are too high, regulations are too burdensome. That's why I'm proposing sweeping, bold changes. Half measures won't do here.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Thanks for coming here. And a while back, you were talking about how you are clear about your issues, and so that when you get elected, you'll have the mandate. And I really appreciate you being straight about that. My question is, and you also talked about keeping the 2/3 requirement in the legislature for the budget, right? Now, if anything, if we have learned anything in the last 1 year, right, getting elected based on an issue and does not give you easy way to enact things. Now, you're promising all these tax cuts, but are you sure you're going to get more than 2/3 of the legislators actually voting for it, other than just sending acrostic veto messages? How are you going to do that?
Your question is really a great question, and the essence of your question is how on earth are you going to get anything done? And Eric, you asked a form of that question earlier, and there's no easy answers. I know this: if we don't try, it'll never get fixed. I also know that there's nothing keeping us from fixing these problems other than political failure and leadership failure. So we're in the middle of a meltdown, which creates rare opportunities. A few years ago, I don't think my bold, sweeping reforms would have much of a chance. Maybe a few years from now, we won't need to be so aggressive. But right now, we're bankrupt, and people are suffering. Do you know that the unemployment rate now is officially 12.5%? If you add in all the people who've quit looking for jobs, plus all the people who have part-time jobs but need full-time jobs, that's 20%. So 4 million Californians are either unemployed or underemployed. Now that's depression-level misery. So when you have a situation like that where Republicans and Democrats and independents, everyone agrees the state's broken and we need to fix it. Under that kind of environment, the legislature is going to pay attention, especially given how clear I am in my campaign. If I'm elected, it will provide that extra political clout. But I'll say this, if I'm blocked and the legislature simply doesn't implement these critical reforms, which, by the way, I still maintain, it's unthinkable that we can't get this state fixed. And we don't have much more time. We're going to get steamrolled in this global economy. We are getting steamrolled. We need to move along at an urgent pace. But if the legislature doesn't fix these problems after I propose them, after I get elected governor, then I will take single-issue ballot initiatives directly to the voters. If we have to, the voters are going to have to take the state back. And there's some very specific, simple, short and sweet ballot initiatives that I will put in front of the voters. in order to get the reforms that we need.
Do we ask follow-up questions?
Of course, go ahead.
If there is one person you remind me of, it's Obama, like a candidate who
That's
promises.
probably not helpful in the Republican primary.
I kind
But
of know
we'll
that.
we'll take that.
Like a candidate promising sweeping reforms, claiming that when he gets elected, he'll have mandate to do it, and then going to face supermajority requirements in the legislature. And, I don't know how you squared your own opposition to the healthcare reform with what you're promising now and what you're saying about how you're going to handle it later.
It's one of these things where if you don't try, it'll never get fixed. So I know it's like my startup companies. The probability of success at the beginning was small. And then over time, I built the confidence of my venture capitalists, and they invested in more money over time. And over time, the probability of success really ratcheted up. Here we have a situation where the state of California is a mess, and we have to start taking some big, bold steps in order to fix it. It's going to be very difficult.
So thank you very much. Sir, you have the honor of the last question.
That's great because I'm torn between two, but
Well, you can have two questions.
okay. First question I have is sort of still a follow-up along the same lines. You talked about the mandate. Governor Schwarzenegger certainly talked about it. Arguably, he had it because it was of the virtue of the recall. No offense intended, but you're probably not as popular as he is. So you have an even more
I can tell you
uphill
that I'm
battle.
more popular now than he is.
Well, that may be. But, you'll have even more of an uphill battle against the legislature than he did because of that fact. How do you see yourself as being different from him?
It's again, a really good question. I mean, voters have a right to be very skeptical and cynical because they've heard this before. This is what Schwarzenegger said a few years ago, and here we are in worse shape. Now, I'm a pretty good friend of Governor Schwarzenegger, but honestly, we're in worse shape than when he started, by a lot. Unemployment rate's doubled, debt's through the roof. Now, his heart's in the right place. I really do think that. But the fact is, when he tried to go after these fundamental structural reforms, he tried to bite off too much in 2005 during that special election. And there were some flaws in some of the ballot initiatives that were pointed out by the opponents. And then he lost his appetite for reform. That's not me. I can promise you this. I'm going to have the tenacity, the backbone, and the will and the drive to not budge. You lose the first time, you try it again. You lose again, you try it again. I mean, we have to get this fixed. I think there's probably not much of a debate of what we need to do. Our taxes are too high. Our spending is out of control. The regulatory system doesn't allow for permits to be obtained to build manufacturing facilities. We have to overhaul that. Our education system is micromanaged by the legislature. We need to push control to the local level. So the first step is let's just all agree on here's the problem, here's the solution, and then let's figure out how to put political pressure on the legislature to get the job done. Now here's one idea I have that's pretty controversial, but I think it's important reform that I'll take directly to the voters if I have to, and that's to convert the legislature from full-time to part-time. Now I know that's counterintuitive to some of you, I bet. I would convert it to no time if I could get away with it. I'm kidding about that part.
So basically, they make fewer laws because they're in the office less.
That's a fact. Right now, there's thousands and thousands of pieces of legislation that flow through the legislature. Now, a few months ago, for example, in the middle of the financial meltdown, they actually debated whether they should form a blueberry commission to promote the sales of blueberries. Now, hey, that's just crazy.
You don't like blueberries?
I love blueberries. I just don't think we need a new commission. Especially, we don't need the legislature focusing on it. The other advantage of a part-time legislature, which exists, by the way, in 42 states have a part-time legislature, is you change the mix of people in the legislature. Part of the part-time legislature proposal is to cut their salaries in half. That would force people in the legislature to have a job someplace else. That'd be a good thing. People who actually come from the trenches. California had a part-time legislature from 1850 to 1967. And then, in my opinion, California started to deteriorate as a state when a professional full-time legislature emerged in the early 1970s. And these professional politicians from both parties have done huge amounts of damage.
So I think that's a natural segue to the second question, which is, how do you distinguish yourself from Governor Brown and what his campaign is? He's clearly a professional career politician, but he at least is saying, look, we tried the mandate with the governor businessman who's going to come in and that didn't work. You need a professional politician to fix things.
That's a great last question, because here, there's one of three people will be governor, that's for sure. Jerry Brown, Meg Whitman, or Steve Poizner. And there's three people that are really vastly different in their backgrounds and their approaches. And you got to love this, right? Voters have choices. That's what campaigns are about, is to draw distinctions and to make the choices crystal clear, and then voters have to decide. And what a perfect time for an election right now, because the state is in trouble and voters need to give guidance, really a mandate to the next governor. So you have Jerry Brown on one end of the spectrum, 40 years of political experience. I mean, he's had just basically one job his whole life, and that's being in politics and being in one elected position after another. So that's, and some people like that extensive experience. That's one end of the spectrum. Personally, I think a lot of voters have had enough with career politicians. I think people are looking for someone who actually has other experiences other than just being in politics, which takes you to the other end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is Meg Whitman, who has no experience in politics. I mean, zero. Didn't vote, never run for office, has no idea what it's like to be in Sacramento. Likes to say all the time, we should run Sacramento like a business. Of course, that should alert people that she doesn't really know much about what she's talking about, because it's not a business. It's not even set up like a business. That's not even the right analogy. Maybe running Sacramento like a well-functioning nonprofit organization, that might be a little bit closer. In any case, that's the other end of the spectrum. And here I am in the middle. And I think this is the sweet spot here. I have this 20 years of experience at starting and running companies from scratch. I know how to create jobs. And that's just essential to get this economy back on track. But I do have this 8 years of success now in public service, in the White House, during the 9/11 crisis, in the classroom, running successfully as insurance commissioner, being a very successful insurance commissioner. I think that the voters are going to zero in on my hybrid skill set here and track record, and that's going to make all the difference in the world in the outcome of this election. Thank you all very much for the opportunity to be here. Really appreciate it. Thank you, Eric.
And Mr. Commissioner, I think all of us in California can thank you and admire you for two things. I think the first is that you're an example of what is good about politics, that people care so much about the state that they give up being an entrepreneur to do something for the better good of the state, and you've clearly done that. And the second is, even if people disagree, the clarity of your positions and the clarity with which you speak, I think, is a welcome improvement in politics today. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you all.
Good luck.
Thanks, Eric. Appreciate it. That's very nice. Thank you all.